As a little girl, Marie Louise hated Napoleon with a passion so fierce it burned within her small hands. She named her ugliest wooden soldier Bonaparte, stabbed it repeatedly with pins as if each prick could wound the real man, and then, in a final symbolic act of loathing, hurled it into the flames of the fireplace. It was a child's ritual of defiance against the monster who had twice forced her family to flee their majestic home at the Vienna Hofburg. Yet, in one of history's most staggering ironies, this same girl would, just a few years later, become Napoleon's wife, the Empress of the French. And when his empire crumbled to dust, she did not follow him into exile, never returned to his side, and in a decision that would haunt her legacy, became increasingly separated from their only son. The question that echoes through the centuries is simple. How could this possibly have happened? Who, behind the titles and the crowns, was Marie Louise really? Her story began on December 12, 1791, in the gilded halls of the Hofburg, where she was born into the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the House of Habsburg. As the daughter of the future Emperor Franz I, her life seemed predestined for a grand but predictable royal marriage. Her childhood was a tranquil tapestry of language lessons, music, and carefree games with her siblings, a sheltered existence blissfully unaware that the world beyond the palace walls was about to be shattered. The source of that shattering was Napoleon Bonaparte. His military campaigns tore through the continent like a storm, and twice, the imperial family had to pack their belongings in frantic haste and flee Vienna. For little Marie Louise, the sound of his name meant only one thing: terror. Servants rushed through long corridors, carriages were frantically prepared, and her home dissolved into chaos. While adults whispered of defeats and threats, she understood, with the sharp clarity of a child, that Napoleon was the great enemy who uprooted everything she loved. This deep-seated hatred manifested in her war games, where she would single out the ugliest wooden soldier, christen him Bonaparte, and subject him to a ritual of torment before cremating him in the fireplace. To her, Napoleon was no genius general. He was the monster of her childhood nightmares. No one could have imagined that this very name would one day define her entire existence. By 1810, the girl who had burned effigies of her enemy had blossomed into a quiet, shy, and multilingual young woman of 18, content with drawing and the secluded life of the Viennese court. Meanwhile, the man who was now her suitor had conquered almost all of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican upstart, had defeated one ruler after another, including Austria, and yet he faced a profound personal crisis. He ruled a global empire but had no heir. His passionate marriage to Josephine, the love of his life, had remained childless. With a heavy heart, he made the agonizing decision to divorce her, not for a lack of love, but for the brutal necessity of dynasty. He needed a son, a prince of the blood, who could inherit his sprawling empire. The search for a new bride turned to the oldest royal houses of Europe, and Austria, battered and desperate for peace, saw an ingenious, if cynical, opportunity. The master strategist Chancellor Metternich crafted a plan to bind the greatest danger to the Habsburg throne, Napoleon, through the sacred bond of marriage. The enemy would become family, and the price for this fragile peace was Marie Louise herself. The young archduchess, raised to loathe him, wrote to a friend that she was prepared to sacrifice her personal happiness for the good of the state, declaring that true happiness consisted of fulfilling one's duty, even when it contradicted one's own heart's desires. The decision was made, and a long, magnificent procession of carriages began its journey toward France, carrying her towards a fate she could never have chosen. What happened next was so unexpected that it seemed almost fictional. The feared conqueror of Europe, who had dethroned kings, became alarmingly nervous about meeting his 18-year-old bride-to-be. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man of iron will, suddenly cared deeply about his appearance. He ordered new tailored clothes, scrutinized his reflection, and even took dance lessons to appear more graceful. He was overheard to say, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, "Now I must become more charming." It was a stunning reversal. The man who held half the world in his fist was terrified of displeasing a young Habsburg princess. When their first official meeting was delayed by strict court ceremonial at the castle of Compiègne, Napoleon's impatience boiled over. He rode out in disguise, intercepted her carriage at a rainy post station, and, completely soaked to the skin, flung open the door and sat down beside her. Marie Louise was startled and did not recognize the drenched stranger until her lady-in-waiting whispered, "Your Majesty, it is the Emperor." She looked at him in surprise, and after a brief, suspended moment, a genuine smile broke across her face, and she uttered the words that would mark the beginning of a transformation. "Look, you look much better than in your portraits." It was her greatest relief, the first crack in the image of the childhood monster. A short while later, another wave of emotion awaited her. At the border, French customs had cruelly forced her to abandon her last tangible links to home. Her little dog, her beloved canary, and even her unfinished embroidery. Yet when she entered her private chambers in France, she could not believe her eyes. Napoleon, in a gesture of profound thoughtfulness that completely contradicted the figure of her nightmares, had personally arranged for her dog, her bird, and her embroidery to be brought to her. The image she had held all her life began to waver, then crumble. She soon wrote to her father in Vienna, describing Napoleon's kindness with startling warmth. "The better one got to know him," she wrote, "the more lovable he seemed." Fear dissolved into curiosity, and curiosity slowly, almost imperceptibly, blossomed into genuine affection. On April 2, 1810, she was ceremoniously crowned Empress of the French in the Great Hall of the Tuileries. She lived in magnificent palaces, wore sumptuous gowns, and was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Yet it was a life in a gilded cage where personal freedom was absent. Nonetheless, she fulfilled her dynastic duty with a strong sense of responsibility, and Napoleon placed ever greater trust in her. The union was sealed in the most significant way possible on March 20, 1811, when after a long and agonizing labor Marie Louise gave birth to a healthy son. For Napoleon, it was one of the happiest days of his life. The little prince was given the resounding title of the King of Rome, the long-awaited heir to a colossal empire. But the tide of history waits for no one. When Napoleon marched off to war again in 1813, he appointed a young Marie Louise, then just 22 years old, as regent of France. She officially represented the emperor, but the world she now held so precariously was already collapsing. The disastrous Russian campaign had bled the Grande Army white, and after the decisive Battle of Leipzig, the Allied armies began their inexorable advance towards Paris. Marie Louise initially refused to abandon the capital, but Napoleon, knowing the danger, insisted she and their son be taken to safety. Tearfully, she complied, leaving Paris behind, unaware that this was a farewell forever. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba. The imperial couple's paths had irretrievably diverged, and Marie Louise would never see her husband again. Napoleon clung to a desperate hope. From Elba, he wrote letter after letter, begging his wife and his beloved son to join him. But in Vienna, a far more ruthless plan was being executed. Her father, Emperor Franz, and Chancellor Metternich were absolutely determined that a daughter of the Habsburgs would not return to the fallen emperor's side. They applied immense, relentless pressure, instructing her to put the past behind her and begin a new life in Austria. For the young empress, it was an impossible, soul-shattering decision. On one side stood her husband, on the other her father, and between them her young son, a political pawn of the highest order. The King of Rome was kept in Vienna, given the title Duke of Reichstadt, and raised under the strict supervision of the Austrian court. He was more than just a grandson. He was Napoleon's rightful heir, a living symbol who could one day ignite a new Bonapartist movement. Austria intended to keep him under absolute control, and for Marie Louise the trap was complete. Had she gone to Napoleon on Elba, she would almost certainly have had to abandon her son. By staying in Austria, she lost her husband. She likely never had a truly free choice. So, she was sent away to the spa town of Aachen, where a new figure was already waiting to reshape her life, the charming and cultivated Austrian General Adam von Neipperg. Officially, he was to be her protector and escort. Unofficially, he was an instrument of Metternich's policy, tasked with making the young Archduchess forget her French emperor. And he succeeded brilliantly. The Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map of Europe, awarded her the small duchy of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla, and in 1816, at the age of 25, Marie Louise entered a new homeland as its dedicated duchess. Contemporaries attest that she governed with a deep sense of duty, genuinely committing herself to the welfare of her subjects. Neipperg, her confidant, remained constantly by her side, and their relationship quickly became far more than official. Together, they had several children, building a quiet, domestic happiness that must have felt like a sanctuary. Shortly after receiving the shocking news of Napoleon's death on the remote island of St. Helena, she and Neipperg married morganatically in 1821, sealing her new life. But the story of Marie Louise is not one of simple happy endings. The tragedies were stacked and waiting. In 1829, Neipperg died, a loss that hit her with devastating force, once again forcing her to say goodbye to a man who had given her stability and affection. Yet the most profound tragedy had already been unfolding far away in Vienna, where her son, the young Duke of Reichstadt, the boy who had once been hailed as the King of Rome and the hope of an empire, was dying. Consumed by tuberculosis and perhaps a broken heart, living as a virtual prisoner under a foreign house. He took his final breath in 1832 at the heartbreakingly young age of 21. The little king had become the ultimate pawn in European politics, and he paid the ultimate price. His life, while his mother was largely absent, a separation that history has judged severely. Marie Louise herself followed on December 17, 1847, dying at the age of 56. Her body was returned to the city where her incredible journey began and was laid to rest in the imperial crypt of the Capuchins in Vienna. So, who was Marie Louise really? The little girl who had so violently stabbed and burned a wooden figure named Bonaparte grew up to lose a husband, a son, a first love, and eventually, any sense of a homeland she could truly call her own. At the end of her life, the monster of her childhood had become the great tragic love of her youth, a man she was forced to abandon, and the son who should have been her legacy became a sacrificial piece on a political chessboard. She was no heroine who sacrificed everything for love, nor was she a cold-blooded traitor who casually betrayed her vows. She was, above all else, a woman whose life was never truly her own, a pawn reshuffled by the hands of her father, her husband, and the architects of a new European order. The girl who set fire to a toy Napoleon in her fireplace was ultimately consumed by the very flames of the world Bonaparte created, leaving behind a legacy not of choice, but of survival.